BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays this year, I've been talking to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history, and in this episode, I will be looking at a key influence on Cooper's decision to commit the skyjacking, and that was the one that was attempted by Paul Cini. And this is a story that I've wanted to examine for quite some time, and I have to give a shout out to Ryan Burns, who runs the D.B. Cooper Sleuth channel, and on a recent episode of his program, he was talking a lot about the Paul Cini Skyjacking, and if you have not subscribed yet to the D.B. Cooper Sleuth channel, I highly, highly recommend it. I know most of you guys probably already have, but just in case, I recommend that you watch Ryan Burns' videos. He is a true expert on D.B. Cooper and on a lot of these other cases. But I don't even think that this is really up for discussion. I said that this was a key influence on the D.B. Cooper skyjacking. Now, we don't know D.B. Cooper's identity as of yet, but as we go through this material, we're going to see how D.B. Cooper may have been responding to the news coverage surrounding the Paul Cini skyjacking and launched his plan. I was also very surprised that there weren't too many sources about this case that were readily available online. I think that the most famous article is one that came from Slate.com, and it was written by Brendan I. Kerner, and it came out in 2013. So we're going to have a read here, and then I will respond. Paul Joseph Cini hijacked a plane because he had an idea, parachuting. He had a shotgun, dynamite, a collapsible shovel, a pup tent, candy bars, a dark blue parachute, and what could go wrong? In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the United States suffered through a skyjacking epidemic that has now been largely forgotten. In a new book, The Skies Belong to Us, Love and Terror in the Golden Age of Hijacking, Brendan Kerner tells the story of the chaotic age when jets were routinely commandeered by the desperate and disillusioned. And in the run-up to his book's publication on June 8th of 2013, Kerner has been writing a series of articles, such as this one. This begins with the Paul Cini skyjacking. November 13th, 1971, Paul Cini skyjacked Air Canada Flight 812 from Vancouver to Toronto with a scheduled stop in Calgary. The story. At a congressional hearing in 1969, Federal Aviation Administration psychologist John Daly testified that skyjackers were primarily motivated by a need for public recognition. And I have to throw in just some interjections right here already. Firstly, we have the epidemic of skyjackings, and we also have this need for recognition. And I think that a very clear example of this is Richard Floyd McCoy, who would come after D.B. Cooper and is a D.B. Cooper suspect himself, because Richard McCoy was a student at BYU, Brigham Young University, and he was trying to write this research paper on how you could have criminological countermeasures against skyjackings, and then he ultimately determined that it was impossible. So someone could get on a plane with explosives, threaten the airline, and the airline is going to have protocols and procedures that they have to follow, and then they're just going to have to comply with these demands. And if the person is able to obtain the parachutes, with the exception of some way, somehow, the jets that are going to be following the plane get a good look at where this person lands, which they wouldn't be able to do at night, then they would have a high chance of getting away with it. Ultimately, McCoy had too many people involved in his inner circle, and a lot of clues were left behind by McCoy's own sloppiness, and the long story short is that McCoy was captured, but I have a standalone episode about him here on this channel, and I invite you to hit the like button and subscribe if you want, and you can follow along with all of these Cooper Friday episodes, and you can also download the audio version of this program for free on Spotify and anywhere you get your podcasts under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And this weekend on Black Box Online Radio, I will be releasing a new chapter in the White Horse Killer saga. It's a series of fictional stories that I write, and I'm on the fourth book now, The Eyes of the White Horse, and there is a playlist. If you haven't heard the previous episodes, you can start from the beginning. But back to the Paul Cini skyjacking. So this could be a predecessor to D.B. Cooper, who was then the predecessor to Richard Floyd McCoy, where people were aware of the possibilities of hijacking an airplane because they didn't have the same types of security measures that were in place. Let's keep looking here. In September of 1970, while downing shots of vodka in his Victoria, British Columbia apartment, Paul Cini had watched a television news segment about a failed skyjacking for ransom. In the midst of the story, his alcohol-fuzzed mind somehow managed to produce a eureka moment. The best way for a hijacker to escape justice was not to fly abroad, but rather to jump from the plane. Cini initially had no designs on attempting this himself, as he was deathly afraid of heights. I have to throw in another interjection as well. I don't like heights at all. I mean, you could even say I'm afraid of heights. My family used to tease me so much because there was this one walking bridge in the town, and I didn't even want to be near the railing because it wasn't very high. But I don't mind being in airplanes, unless it's one of those really crappy airplanes that feels like it's about to fall out of the sky. And I've also been bungee jumping before, and that was on a platform that was about 400 feet in the air. And once you get to a certain altitude, once you get to a certain height off the ground, it doesn't bother you as much. And it's really hard to say because you might be 100 feet off the ground or on a cliffside or something like that. Yeah, I get the ill feelings about, being afraid of heights and so on. But once I'm very high off the ground, then I don't feel it. And I think that a lot of other people are going to experience the exact same things. Okay, so in fact, when Paul Cini had done his brief stint in the Canadian Army, he had been too petrified to scale a telephone pole during an exercise. Perfect example. Something like that might even bother me, but again, being on a 400-foot platform or being in an airplane would not. The more he contemplated the risky caper, the more he became convinced that it represented his one shot at improving his lackluster life, which was marred by alcoholism and dim prospects. I wanted recognition, he would later explain. I wanted to stand up and say, hey, I'm Paul Cini, I'm here and I exist, and I want to be noticed. So this is something that really ties into a lot of the observations that have been made by Dr. David G. Hubbard, who has 2 books out on the psychological profiling of skyjackers, and that is that they're usually people who are working low-level jobs. They don't have an enormous amount of money. Yes, there is a financial motive and a financial aspect to committing these skyjackings, but it's not the only motive. They also want to act like they're really cool, and they want to act like they are very tough and they're very smart. And Paul Cini perhaps said it the best right here. He says that this is all about recognition. And Cini boarded Flight 812 in Calgary with a bag containing everything that he thought he would need to pull off the hijacking and then survive in the wilderness after jumping from a plane: a sawed-off shotgun, dynamite, a sheepskin rope, a collapsible shovel, a pup tent, candy bars, hiking boots, and a dark blue parachute wrapped in a paper bag. After downing several screwdrivers, he brandished his weapon and announced that he was a member of the Irish Republican Army who would blow up the DC-8 unless he was given $1.5 million and a passage to Ireland. The plane landed in Great Falls, Montana, where Cini received all the cash that Air Canada could muster, a mere $50,000. Unlike fellow hijacker Arthur Gates Barkley, who had freaked out when TWA shorted him by over $99,000, Cini didn't mind the lesser ransom. And if anything, I think that would have been a smart move on Paul Cini's part. See, this is one where I don't condone any of his actions, but what is he going to do? Sit around and complain for more money? Sit around and wait? That could lead to something else going wrong. It would be smarter to take the money that was offered, even if it wasn't the correct amount, and then go along with it. Now, D.B. Cooper might have had a few more smarts, and we're going to see very clearly about how and why D.B. Cooper could be smarter than Paul Cini. The DC-8 was en route back to Calgary to refuel when Cini told the crew to open one of the emergency exits so that he could jump to freedom, but try as he might, Cini couldn't undo the twine that he had used to wrap his parachute. The knot was too tight, especially for the man with fine motor skills that was impaired by copious amounts of alcohol consumption. The frustrated Cini asked one of the pilots to lend him a sharp instrument to cut his parachute. When the pilot offered him the DC-8's fire axe, Cini absent-mindedly laid down his shotgun to accept it. Seeing that the hijacker was now unarmed, the pilot kicked away the shotgun and grabbed Cini by the throat. Another crew member took the axe and smashed it into Paul Cini's head, fracturing his skull. Paul Cini would be remembered as the world's first parajacker fool. Okay, now this is definitely a bungling attempt at the skyjacking, but as far as his actions and choices go here, part of me was wondering that was DB Cooper sitting back, reading the newspapers, hearing about this story on the news, and just thinking, I could do it better. This is approximately 9 or 10 days before D.B. Cooper skyjacking on November 24th of 1971, when he boarded Flight 305 going from Portland to Seattle, and he handed notes to the flight attendants, and everything they're saying is that Cooper is cool, calm, and collected. He is somebody who is not trying to do these brash things. Paul Cini is wearing a black mask, that's one thing. Paul Cini is carrying a shotgun. That's another point where, Cooper might have had the awareness to know that if you have the briefcase bomb with what appears to have been a bomb, and you don't need to carry a shotgun because you already have the threat of detonating the explosive. That would be one point. And then also, Cooper did something that I think shows that he was completely aware of what happened with Paul Cini, and that was that he ordered Tina Mucklow, the stewardess, and the cabin crew to stay in the cockpit when he was attempting his jump, because he wanted to create that distance, and he wanted to have just some space between the crew and himself, even though he probably had gained Tina Mucklow's trust by that point, but he wanted to eliminate the possibility of being hit in the head with an object the way that Paul Cini was. And there was even another article that was talking about how Paul Cini may have sabotaged himself simply because he tied the knot too tightly. The twine that was used to tie the parachute was tied too tightly, and that was his ultimate downfall. He may have gotten away with this. And again, from a little bit more reading, it seems that Paul Cini wanted to jump out into the Canadian wilderness because he thought that nobody would find him there. Was D.B. Cooper thinking something very similar about jumping out into the woods of Washington State? Okay, that's not the Canadian wilderness. There are definitely more towns and more cities that are going to be nearby as opposed to just rural Canada, but D.B. Cooper has never been identified to this day, and I think all of these thought processes went into the planning of the Cooper skyjacking. More importantly, I think that D.B. Cooper looked at this story and was thinking, this is where this Paul Cini guy has gone wrong. This is where I'm going to do it, and how I'm going to do it right. Now, this also begs the question of how and why does Cooper decide to do this? By asking the question why, is he in line with the psychological profile that people create about how this is some poor guy, doesn't earn a lot of money, he's maybe even experiencing financial trouble? Someone who was perhaps down on his luck, someone who was experiencing financial hardship, didn't have a lot of prospects, he wanted infamy, he wanted recognition, the way that Paul Cini claimed that he did. A lot of people would say that, and a lot of people would subscribe to that type of theory, unless they're promoting a suspect like Ted B. Braden, perhaps, or E. Howard Hunt, because I always go back to Nat LeFouque's book when he was talking about how people just have it in their minds that D.B. Cooper has to be some type of poor working-class guy who did this for money, fame, and recognition. If this is an unsolved case, how on earth do we know that? So I'm really on the fence because the suspects like Ted Braden and E. Howard Hunt become a little bit more viable as you examine them over time. Especially Ted Braden, who was ex-CIA and Special Forces and so on, someone who would have been very, very equipped and skilled and have the abilities to commit this skyjacking effortlessly. I give full credit to Drew Beeson, author of Paratrooper of Fortune, for all of his observations, but I think we have to just agree with Nat LeFouque and say that this was an unsolved case. But I also want to go to a particular news article that was written in the Montreal Gazette about the Paul Cini skyjacking, and let's get a little bit of additional information. Calgary, Alberta. Paul Joseph Cini was 27 years old. He was a truck driver from Calgary who allegedly hijacked Air Canada flight DC-8. He allegedly hijacked an Air Canada DC-8 flight, Friday is in fair condition in the hospital. A Royal Canadian Mounted Police spokesman said in Calgary that Cini had been charged with interfering with transportation facilities under Section 232 of the Criminal Code. He said that Paul Joseph Cini will probably be arraigned once he is physically able to appear in court. And the only photo of Paul Cini that I could find is the one where he is in the hospital. There is a photo that was used for the archival footage, and it's in the thumbnail of a video that has the news footage and interviews about people who interacted with Paul Cini on the plane. And that is a witness, actually, who was just someone who was told that the plane was being skyjacked, and he thought that the whole thing was a joke, and he's even laughing about it. But that is not Paul Cini. The only photo that I've been able to find of him is the one where he's in the hospital bed, and there are bars around him. The hospital where Paul Joseph Cini is recovering from the axe blow to the head, which subdued him Saturday, is said to be remained in semi-conscious state with a suspected concussion or skull fracture, still not confirmed by doctors. But as we have since learned, that was a skull fracture. There has been no change since Saturday, and he is still under observation and in fair condition. From Scotland, Cini, described by neighbours as well-mannered and quiet, he arrived in Canada with his family 10 years ago from Glasgow, Scotland. And this is another thing that I thought was a rather odd choice in Paul Cini's skyjacking, to say that he was an IRA terrorist from the Irish Republican Army, IRA. And I just thought that that was a rather bizarre choice for someone to say when they were hijacking a Canadian flight. Perhaps there are other things that he could have said, or perhaps there are other stories that he could have used, but the fact that he was from Scotland, I think that he may have been able to think that he was capable of pulling that off, or he thought in his own mind that he could have convincingly portrayed an IRA terrorist in his own mind. But at a certain point, they're not even going to care too much if he's saying that he's an IRA terrorist, or that he's just some guy who's trying to get to Montana because he wants to leave the country or whatever. They're going to have to go along with his demands and so on. But more importantly, I think that this is also about providing a diversion and a cover story, and that's what it seems like Paul Cini wanted to do. He wanted to put people in this type of false sense of security, but he wanted to confuse them. He's like, yeah, I'm an IRA terrorist. Oh, wait, actually, no, I just want the money, and I just want recognition, and I just want to jump out of the plane into the wilderness and sleep in his pup tent. Notice that D.B. Cooper did not do this. D.B. Cooper didn't say that he was any particular type of terrorist. D.B. Cooper just said that he had a grudge. He even said that he didn't have a grudge against Northwest Orient. This is also something where I think that Cooper was a little bit more confident in his abilities, perhaps because he had the blueprint and model that was created by Paul Cini, and he didn't have to add in these additional elements. He knows that he can get on the plane, he can acquire the money, he can get the ransom and the parachutes. He knows that he can jump out over a certain rural area that isn't going to be extremely easy to track down. I mean, I'm sure that it's not the best choice for jumping in the world. It's not the most ideal drop zone, but he knew that he could achieve this without making up any type of cockamamie story about being an IRA terrorist or a Glasgow, Scotland terrorist. The last part wasn't meant to be taken seriously, mind you, but I just wanted to throw that out there. The hijacker who led his erratic behavior on the Air Canada DC-8 jet with his 6-hour course to Great Falls, Montana, and mid-course corrections necessitated by his own indecision as to whether the plane should travel to New York, Phoenix, or his final choice, Calgary, was subdued after threatening to bail out over Calgary. And I think, again, this would tie into Paul Cini's plan. I think he knew exactly where he wanted to jump, and I think Cooper knew exactly where he wanted to jump as well, because this is just like a ruse. It's confusion. It's throwing people off. The one thing that I do think D.B. Cooper was trying to do to throw people off was that Cooper was saying this stuff about how he wanted to fly to Mexico. He's talking about, other possible destinations. They ultimately agree on flying to Reno, Nevada, because the plane that they were on, Flight 305, would not be able to fly all the way to Mexico. They said they had to refuel. He agreed on Reno, Nevada. I don't think that D.B. Cooper cared about that at all. That may be one element of his story that actually was a ruse. I think he knew that he was going to jump out over the Pacific Northwest. I think he knew that he wanted to jump out over the Washington State, Oregon State border. But that's just me. As I said, this is an unsolved case. And I would also like to go to an article from the Desert Sun, November 19th, 1971. Canadian hijacker faces big charges. Calgary, Alberta. A Calgary, Alberta man was faced today with 7 charges for carrying a maximum penalty of life imprisonment in connection with the hijacking last Friday of an Air Canada DC-8. Paul Joseph Cini, aged 27 years old, remained silent with his head bowed during a 5-minute appearance in Alberta Provincial Court Thursday to hear the charges read. I'm not surprised that he has his head down because he wanted to be famous, or maybe Paul Cini wanted to be a type of D.B. Cooper legend, and instead, he didn't end up being D.B. Cooper, the cool, calm, and collected Cooper that we all know. Paul Cini ended up being some guy that got hit in the head with a blunt object, and he's the guy who got a skull fracture from the crew. So I shouldn't say blunt object. They may have hit him with the sharp side of the axe, excuse me. But more importantly, Paul Cini is nothing more than a bungler, which he honestly was. Cini entered no plea and there was no application for bail. He was remanded in custody to November 23rd. The 6-hour hijack attempt occurred last Friday when a masked man armed with a sawed-off shotgun and holding dynamite took a stewardess captive and ordered the Air Canada flight from Vancouver to Montreal to be flown to Great Falls, Montana. In Montana, the man demanded $1.5 million in ransom. A rope was lowered from the cockpit of the DC-8 and $50,000 was taken aboard. Now, this is one where I'm not completely certain about. You notice that D.B. Cooper didn't do this about lowering a rope and taking it aboard. He instructed Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant, to go out and get the parachutes and get the money, and then she gets back on the plane. I mean, maybe Cooper thought it was just easier to do this without the rope. Cooper was very practical, and we don't necessarily know all of the items that Cooper was carrying, but I don't think that Cooper would have had a pup tent. And perhaps that's because Cooper knew that he could get back to civilization in a faster method. And I mean, that's Paul Cini's whole plan, right? To jump out over the Canadian wilderness because it would have been very difficult for people to find him in the vast lands of Canada. Now, Cooper did not have that luxury, and that's both a gift and a curse, because then Cooper could just easily get to his vehicle, he could get to his accomplice, he could get to the town, he could get where he wanted to go more easily, but he has a bigger risk of being seen. But, I mean, I'm just going to ask you guys, do you think D.B. Cooper cared too much about risks? I don't. I don't think Cooper was afraid of risks, but that's just me. In Montana, the man demanded $1.5 million in ransom, and a rope was lowered from the cockpit of the DC-8, and $50,000 was taken aboard. The aircraft then took off from Regina, Saskatchewan, but returned to Great Falls, where he permitted the 114 passengers and 3 of the 9 crew members to disembark. The man then ordered the plane to be flown to Phoenix, but he changed his mind when the plane was in air, and he said that he wanted to go to Calgary. I've already said I don't think he actually wanted to go to Phoenix. I think he wanted to be in Canada. Just before reaching Calgary, the Cini decided that he wanted to bail out. When he put down his shotgun, Captain Vernon Eamon jumped him, and a purser slugged him on the head with the handle of the fire axe. So it was blood and force trauma, and he got hit with the handle of the fire axe. But that really is an important thing to note, that it's first that the captain sees that he has put down the shotgun as he's trying to get the twine off, so he actually goes for Paul Cini's throat, and then the purser is the one who takes the fire axe and is assaulting him. But there is an individual that I have not mentioned in this episode yet, and her name is Mary Doheny, Dohey, and she is more or less one of the heroes of the Paul Cini Skyjacking story, because she was the one who was able to control his behavior. As I've said many times, Cooper was what? Cool, calm, and collected, right, during the entire time. D.B. Cooper did not need to be controlled. And yes, they would have wanted to keep Cooper in a calm situation, and the stewardesses, particularly Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner, did a reasonably good job of that. They didn't try to aggravate him, but Cooper definitely didn't seem to have these types of emotional problems that Paul Cini did. And when I say that, it's because Mary Doheny was a former psychiatric nurse. Prior to becoming a flight attendant, she was a psychiatric nurse, and she knew specific methods to use to try and calm somebody down who was losing control, because everything that I'm seeing about Paul Cini is that he's brash, he's sloppy, he's a mess. Whereas D.B. Cooper is like, this guy's brash, he's sloppy, and he's a mess. I could perpetuate a skyjacking without doing any of those things, and I could do it successfully. So there's an article that's actually written about Mary Doheny on the website irishcentral.com. It's a website that I've never used before for Black Box Online Radio. I always like finding new publications, and this one is written by C.J. Clancy, just citing the source, and it was actually only put out about 2 months ago in 2024 at the time of this recording. Mary Imelda Doheny was one of only 20 recipients of Canada's Cross of Valor, awarded for courage in circumstances of extreme peril. Mary Imelda Doheny was born in Cape Shore, St. Bride's, Newfoundland in 1933. She was the youngest of 14 children. When Mary was of 3 years of age, her mother passed away, forcing her father to place the young child and the second youngest, her brother Jack, into foster care. The following 6 years in foster care would prove to be extremely harsh. She spent some time in the Belvedere Orphanage in St. John's before being adopted at 10 years of age by a very caring couple with a large family called Michael and Catherine Rice. By that I just mean the Rice family. I think that's what they're trying to say. After school, Doheny went on to train as a psychiatric nurse. On completion of her training, she applied for a job as an air stewardess with Air Canada and was accepted. I was a little bit surprised when I saw that there's this very abrupt career change in her plans, but ultimately, this turned out to be a good thing. The Doomsday Flight. On November 12th of 1971, Mary was working on a routine flight from Vancouver to Toronto when Paul Joseph Cini boarded at a regular stopover in Calgary. He was wearing a large overcoat and carrying a large bag. Cini downed a number of shots before pulling out a shotgun and announcing that he was a member of the Irish Republican Army and was willing to blow up the plane unless he received $1.5 million and a safe passage to Ireland. And as I said, that was obviously a fake story. He approached Mary, wearing a black mask covering his face with a shotgun in hand, and placed the muzzle of the shotgun under her chin. Nervously, he ordered Doheny to raise her hand, holding the detonator wires attached to 2 bundles of 60 sticks in total of dynamite between the thumb and the forefinger. By that I think it means that he had 2 bundles of 30 sticks of dynamite, which sounds like a lot. That definitely sounds like a bigger bomb than what Cooper was carrying. And again, this is what Cooper's doing. He's like, this guy, Paul Cini, is doing all of these excessive and unnecessary things. He doesn't need the shotgun. He doesn't need 60 sticks of dynamite. You could do this with a smaller amount and still achieve things. You could do this with the amount of dynamite that would be necessary to place into what? A briefcase. Cooper was smart. Cini was not, if I can be very honest. And I also want to point out one thing. And I know that this is an article from irishcentral.com that was written in 2024, but this states that Paul Cini is holding a shotgun to the flight attendant's face, placing the gun under her chin, and it says that he's the one who's nervous. Nervously, he ordered Doheny to raise her hand, holding the detonator wires attached to 2 bundles. He's the one who's nervous. This guy is a wreck. And that's why I think that Cooper took this story and he improved upon it. He knew where the flaws were. He knew how to correct this stuff. And this might not even be a reflection of D.B. Cooper in his personal life. This was a reflection of his understanding of the Paul Cini story. Prior to Cini boarding the flight, he saw a news report regarding a failed airplane ransom attempt. After watching this news piece, he had a eureka moment. He planned on jumping from the plane during the flight and trying to escape the plane after it landed. Like the fools on the news, Cini had recently experienced a breakup, and it proved to be the straw that broke the camel's back for his mental health. Okay, so interestingly, Paul Cini is watching the stuff on the news and thinking, I could do better at these guys. The only problem is, he absolutely could not. At one stage, his shotgun actually went off during the flight, narrowly missing Doheny's head. At no stage did she show any panic. And I think this relates back to her understanding of human behavior. She responded to the shotgun discharge with, "You didn't mean to do that, did you, dear?" She then asked if she could hold his hand, which he accepted. She began to placate Cini and became a sort of confidant to him, all the while holding the wires of the bomb between her fingers. Cini kept repeating that everyone on board was going to die, and she began mentioning that she hears kids are on board, and that she's one of 14 siblings, and she notices the effect that it's having on Cini, and she continues to placate him. So, I think that this is like just kind of instincts, training taken over. Someone who has been trained as a psychiatric nurse has just been instructed on how to deal with these types of situations in the past when someone is becoming irate and emotionally unstable, and she just knew what to do. She just went into, I'm afraid to say it, but autopilot mode, and she knew exactly how to calm somebody down, and there's a reason why she was given the award for courage. The plane eventually lands in Great Falls, Montana, for Cini to collect his ransom. A suitcase was squeezed through a hatch on the plane. All the while, Doheny was being held at gunpoint by Cini. The suitcase only contained $50,000, but it appeared to be sufficient. Cini offered Doheny to walk off the plane to safety, but incredibly, she refused. This should also go against anyone who thinks that Tina Mucklow was involved with D.B. Cooper in some way and they were in cahoots together. I don't think that this Mary Doheny was involved with Paul Cini at all. Instead, it's just, it's part of the system. Like, she wants to do something that is going to keep him in a state where he doesn't detonate the bomb. Doheny later explained, I knew if I got off or if I got up from his side, he would go berserk and shoot everyone else. I was like his security blanket, like a mother is. Doheny could see that she was soothing Cini and calming him down. Her training and experience as a psychiatric nurse was standing to her. Training and experience nobody else on board possessed. After the plane took off and returned to Calgary, Cini ordered the plane to be flown at 1,000 feet. Next, he ordered the plane and the crew to open the emergency door in preparation for the jump. It's then that Cini gets into bother. He was unable to untie the rope that was tied around his parachute. He requested a sharp object from one of the pilots to cut it free altogether. The pilot offered him a hand axe, resulting in Cini unbelievably placing his shotgun down on the deck to grab the axe. The sight of the shotgun being on the deck prompted the pilot and the crew to set upon Cini. The pilot lunged at his throat, and a crew member struck him in the head with the axe handle. The entire duration of the hijacking was 8 hours. Cini was charged and sentenced to life in prison, but he was paroled 10 years later. And from the other articles that I've been talking about in this episode, I've gathered that they mean that Paul Cini was given the life sentence as a way to deter other skyjackers. Did it work? No, clearly it didn't, because, well, we had D.B. Cooper doing this stuff 9-10 days later, and he did it more successfully. And D.B. Cooper has never been punished for this to this day, even if he went to jail for something else. For Mary Doheny's courageous actions, she was awarded Canada's highest honor for bravery, the Cross of Valor, in December of 1976. Only the third individual and the first living person at the time to receive the award. Doheny was credited for saving the lives of 200 passengers and crew by remaining calm and under control with the unstable psychotic Paul Cini. And I'm not like a doctor or anything, but even I was wondering about that when she's just saying this stuff. If she leaves, he's going to go berserk. The fact that he is just carrying the shotgun and using the black mask, whereas somebody like D.B. Cooper would have the sense to know, I don't need a shotgun on board, and I'm going to wear a pair of sunglasses. That's going to be my disguise. Hello, Clark Kent. I mean, because D.B. Cooper's one step above Clark Kent because he has the shaded glasses. That's all that's necessary, but a lot of the actions of Paul Cini do show a high degree of mental instability, in my own amateur opinion. Doheny also took an absence from her career to volunteer for the Dr. Tom Dooley Foundation, spending 6 months in Kathmandu to both nurse and train nurses. Doheny passed away on June 12th of 2017 at the age of 83 years old. At this time, I would just like to ask you guys the challenge question. Do you believe that the Paul Cini Skyjacking was a direct influence on D.B. Cooper's choices? Now, this may have been something that Cooper was thinking about before. I completely admit to that. D.B. Cooper may have even had a skyjacking plan well before the Paul Cini news, but I think he used this skyjacking as a direct template. I believe that D.B. Cooper was a direct copycat of Paul Cini, and he was a little bit smarter. He had better temperament, and everything that I'm seeing from D.B. Cooper is that he was not a psychotic. He was not someone who would have wanted to just crumble and crash and burn. And maybe Tina Mucklow started out by thinking that way, that, okay, if I don't do what this guy says, then he's going to blow up the plane. There is a little bit of psychosis in that, but just a little bit, not to the point where he's just going to lose all control of his faculties. Cooper is in control. Paul Cini was about to go out of control. What do you think about any of the observations that I've made in this episode? Furthermore, what do you think about the Paul Cini Skyjacking giving us a world into D.B. Cooper's life prior to Flight 305? Because do you think that D.B. Cooper was somebody like Paul Cini, a guy who was down on his luck, lost his relationship, he was working a menial job or a low-paying job, and he wanted to do this for two specific reasons: money and infamy, money and fame, money and recognition? What do you think about that statement? Overall, I'm tempted to agree with it, unless we have a revelation tomorrow, and it turns out that D.B. Cooper was E. Howard Hunt or Ted Braden. But I would love to know your responses. Please put them in the comment section down below. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want. You guys know where to find all the stuff. blackboxonlineradio@aol.com is my email address. blackboxned88 on Instagram, blackboxned88 on TikTok, and my name is Ned Doheny on Facebook. There's also a Black Box Online Radio page over there, and I will see you guys on Zodiac Monday, talking about the Zodiac Killer, and there will be a new episode in the White Horse Killer saga coming out tomorrow. That's all for me. Until next time.